The cold came first, before I even opened my eyes. I was lying on something hard and flat, and a thin wire of fear ran through me because I could not remember how I had gotten there. My back pressed against metal that felt like ice. Somewhere above me, a machine made a flat, empty sound, the kind of sound a machine makes when it has decided there is nothing left worth measuring. A voice spoke in a language I did not understand. It was deep and wet, like words spoken underwater. Another voice answered it. I kept my eyes shut. Every lesson from my years on cargo runs through the dark edges of told me the same thing. Do not move. Listen first. Understand the room before the room understands you. So I listened, and I learned 3 things very quickly. The first was that I was not alone. There were others lying beside me, shoulder to shoulder on the same long slab of metal. I could feel the weight of them, but none of them were breathing. They were the rest of my crew. Owen, who used to fix the engines and complain about the food. Grace, who could read a star map faster than the ship's computer. The others whose laughs I would never hear again. They were gone, and I was lying in a row with them as if I belonged there too. The second thing I learned was that the creatures in the room thought I was gone as, well, I did not understand their words, but I understood their tone. It was the bored, tired tone of people doing a job they had done 1,000 times. One of them tapped something against my chest, a cold rod that pressed and released, pressed and released. The flat machine sound continued. Nothing, empty, dead. That was when I understood the third thing, and it almost made me laugh. Even there, even then. Their machine could not find my heartbeat because their machine was not built to look this slow. My heart has always been a calm, steady thing. On the medical charts back home, doctors used to frown at it and ask if I was an athlete. 48 beats a minute, slow and even, like a man tapping his finger while he waits for a kettle to boil. Whatever these creatures were, their own hearts must have raced like drums, because their scanner was searching for something fast and frightened. It found only my quiet, patient pulse, and it decided the patient pulse was no pulse at all. So I lay still. I breathed in shallow sips through my nose, slow enough that my chest barely moved, and I peeked through the smallest crack between my eyelids. They were tall. That was the first thing. They stood nearly 2 heads above me, broad across the shoulders, with skin the color of dark stone. Down each side of their necks ran long ridges, like the fins of a fish, and those ridges twitched and flexed as they spoke. Their arms were thick and corded, built for power. Everything about them said the same thing. We are strong, we hit hard, we win quickly. There were 2 of them in the room, working slowly, dragging the slab toward a wide opening in the far wall. Beyond that opening I saw an orange glow, and a wave of dry heat rolled out of it. They were going to put us into the fire. My slow heart did its first fast thing in a long while. It jumped. I had a choice, and I had it in the space of a single breath. Stay still and let them carry me into the heat with the others, and hope for some chance later that might never come. Or move now, while they thought I was just another body, and lose the only advantage I had, which was that they did not know I was alive. The slab tilted. My shoulder began to slide toward the orange light. The heat touched my face like an open oven, and that decided it for me. I opened my eyes all the way and turned my head, and I looked straight at the nearest creature. It froze. For a long moment neither of us moved. Its fins, which had been twitching lazily, went stiff and flat against its neck. Its wide eyes, dark and round, locked on mine. I watched the certainty drain out of it. A body had looked at it. A dead thing had turned its head. Then it made a sound I will never forget, a short, sharp bark of pure panic, so loud it hurt my ears. It stumbled backward and knocked into a tray of tools that crashed across the floor. The second creature spun around, saw my open eyes, and made the same panicked noise. I sat up. I will not pretend I was brave or calm. My whole body screamed at me, my ribs ached. My mouth was dry as paper, and my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. But I sat up on that cold metal slab in front of the 2 giants, swung my feet down to the floor and stood. I stood because lying down had nearly gotten me burned, and standing felt like the only honest thing left to do. The 2 of them backed away from me as if I were the dangerous one, as if I were the monster. 2 creatures who could have snapped me in half were pressing themselves against the wall, fins flat, voices high and shaking. I held up both my open hands, the oldest gesture there is, empty, no harm in me. I do not know if they understood, but they stopped shouting long enough for heavy footsteps to come pounding down the corridor outside. More of them poured into the room. 5, then 8, then more than I could count, all of them tall and broad and armed with curved blades and short metal rods that hummed with a sound I did not like. They formed a half circle around me, and the 2 who had thought I was dead pointed at me and spoke quickly, their words tumbling over each other. I stayed perfectly still in the center of all those weapons. I kept my hands up. I kept my breathing slow, and I waited. After a moment, the wall of bodies parted and someone new walked in. He was bigger than all of them. Not just taller, but heavier, denser, as if he'd been built out of a harder material than the rest. His fins were not flat with fear. They stood up tall and proud, and they were a deep, bright red along their edges, while everyone else's were a dull gray. The way the others stepped back from him told me everything. This one was in charge. This one they feared more than they feared a dead man waking up. He stopped in front of me and looked down. His eyes moved over me slowly, from my dusty boots to my tired face, and I saw something in them that I would come to know very well in the days ahead. He was not afraid. He was curious, and worse than that, he was amused. He said something to the room, and the room laughed. It was an ugly rolling sound, all those deep voices at once. He reached out one huge hand and pushed my shoulder with a single finger, almost gently, the way a child pokes an insect to see if it will move. I rocked back on my heels and caught my balance and stood straight again. He poked me a second time, harder. I caught my balance again. The third time I saw it coming and I stepped back out of reach before his finger touched me. The room went quiet. He had not expected me to move out of the way. None of them had. To them I was a thing, a curiosity, a corpse that had forgotten the rules. And the corpse had just sidestepped the most powerful person in the building. He stared at the empty air where my shoulder had been. Then he tilted his head back and made a long, low sound that rumbled in his chest. I realized he was laughing again, but differently this time. Not at me, at the situation, at the strange little surprise of it. He turned to his people and spoke a long stream of words, pointing at me, then pointing somewhere far away, beyond the walls. Whatever he said, it pleased them. The fins along their necks lifted and spread, and they made a sharp hissing cheer, all of them together, until the room buzzed with it. Then two of them stepped forward and took my arms. And this time I did not resist, because there were too many of them and I had nowhere to run, and I wanted, more than anything, to live long enough to understand. They marched me out of that cold room of bodies and into the bright halls of their ship, and I got my first real look at where I was. It was a warship. There was no mistaking it. The corridors were wide and gray, and lined with weapons racks. Through tall windows I could see the curve of a planet below us, brown and gold and ringed with dust, and the dark shapes of other ships hanging in the black around us like a school of hunting fish. Wherever these creatures came from, there were a great many of them, and they were very good at building machines for war. They put me in a small cell with thick walls and a door I could not open. They gave me a cup of water which surprised me, and I drank it slowly and made it last. Then I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and tried to think. I did not know their language. I did not know their name for themselves, or the name of the big one with the red fins. I did not know what they wanted with me, or why the leader had pointed at a faraway place and made his people cheer. But I knew one thing for certain, and it was a small, hard, useful thing, and I held on to it. They thought they understood me. They thought I was weak because I was small. They thought I was finished because their machine could not hear my heart. They had me sorted into a box in their minds, and every box they put me in was wrong. Hours passed, the light in the cell never changed. My ribs stopped aching as much. My mouth stopped feeling like paper. My slow heart kept its steady, patient rhythm, the same rhythm it had kept all my life, the same rhythm that had saved me from the fire, because it was too quiet for their machines to find. Then the door opened, and the big one with the red fins filled the doorway. He did not come in. He just looked at me for a while, the way a man looks at a tool he is thinking about using. Then he reached behind him and tossed something onto the floor of my cell. It landed with a heavy clang and slid to a stop against my boot. It was a blade, a curved one like the ones his soldiers carried, but old and worn. It was so heavy that when I lifted it with both hands my arms shook. I could barely hold it off the floor. I looked up at him, confused, and he watched my struggle with that same amused tilt of his head. He said one word, just one. He said it slowly, carefully, as if he wanted to be sure I would remember it even though I could not understand it. Then he pointed at me, and pointed at the blade, and made a slow sweeping motion with his arm toward the wider world beyond the cell. I did not need the language to understand. I had seen enough of his kind, enough of the weapons and the warship and the proud red fins, to put the pieces together. He was going to make me fight, in front of everyone, tomorrow or the next day, or whenever they were ready to be entertained. They would put me in some open place with this blade I could barely lift, and they would expect me to die quickly and bravely, or quickly and badly, and either way they would laugh and call it sport. The door closed. I sat alone in the gray light with the heavy blade across my knees. And here is the strange thing. I should have been afraid. Any sensible person would have been. But sitting there, running my thumb along the worn edge of that ancient weapon, I felt something else rising in me, slow and steady and certain, just like my heart. They thought they were giving me a short, hopeless fight. They did not know what I knew about my own kind. They did not know where we came from, or how we had spent the long ages of our history. They did not know that long before we built ships and crossed the dark, we had survived on a hot and open world by being the one animal that simply would not stop. Not the fastest, not the strongest. The one that kept going after everything else had given up and lain down in the shade. The big one with the red fins wanted to fight me. He had just handed me all the room I would ever need to win. The cell stayed dark for a long time, and I used the dark the way I had learned to use everything else that day, which was carefully. I did not waste the hours. I sat with the heavy blade across my knees and I learned it. I lifted it 100 times, fighting the shaking in my arms, learning exactly how much strength each lift cost me and how quickly that strength came back. I learned the way the worn grip bit into my blistering hands. I learned that I could not hold the thing ready for more than a few seconds at a time, and that knowing this was better than not knowing it, because a man who understands the true size of his weakness can plan around it, while a man who pretends to be stronger than he is will be undone by the first hard moment. And I listened. The guards outside my cell spoke to one another in their wet, rolling language, and I let the sounds wash over me until certain ones began to repeat. A short word that came whenever they handed me water. A longer word that came with a gesture toward the deep parts of the ship. A hard, barking word that one of them used when he wanted another to stand, to rise, to get up off the bench where he had been resting. I gathered these sounds like a man gathering dry sticks, not knowing yet which ones would catch fire, only knowing that I would need every one of them. Most of all, I thought about my crew, because I owed them that. I let myself remember Owen laughing at something with his sleeves rolled up to the elbow, grease to his wrists. I let myself remember Grace bent over her charts, telling me the stars were just a problem you could solve if you were patient enough. I let the faces come, and I did not push them away, because I had decided that whatever happened to me out there in front of those thousands, I would carry my crew into it. They had not been given a chance to fight for their lives. I had, and I was not going to waste the only thing they had not been given. When the wall in front of me finally slid up into the ceiling, I was ready. Not unafraid, just ready, which is a different and more useful thing. The noise reached me before the light did. A roar of voices, thousands upon thousands of them, a wall of sound so thick and so deep that I felt it press against my chest before my eyes had even adjusted. I shielded my face with one arm and stepped out onto hot-packed sand, the heavy blade dragging behind me, and as the glare faded into shapes I saw the place they had built to watch me end. It was an enormous bowl, carved down into the surface of a planet, so wide that the far rim swam in heat haze and looked like the edge of the world. Pale sand stretched in every direction, ringed by steep stone walls, and those walls were packed from bottom to top with the tall gray bodies of the creatures who had taken me. There were more of them gathered in that single place than I had ever seen of any living thing. Their neck fins rose and fell in great waves as they cheered, a rippling field of dull gray, broken here and there by the bright proud red of the ones who led them. And above all of it, 3 suns, not one, like the warm yellow sun I had grown up under. 3 of them, sitting at different heights in a sky bleached almost white, and their heat came down together onto the sand like something with weight, like a hand pressing flat against the top of my head. Within seconds the sweat broke out across my back and my forehead and the backs of my knees. Within a minute my shirt was soaked through and clinging. I should have been afraid of that heat. Instead, standing alone in the middle of that great bowl with the eyes of a whole people on me, I felt my mouth pull into a smile I could not stop. I knew how it must have looked. A small soft creature, alone on the sand, surrounded by thousands who wanted to watch it fall, grinning up at a punishing sky like a fool. But I smiled because of the heat, and because of a quiet gift my body carried that none of these tall gray giants could match, and that not one of them knew to fear. Sweat. Just sweat. The plain, unlovely thing that runs down a working back on a hot day. Most creatures do not have much of it. They cool themselves in other ways, by panting, by resting in shade, by lying still until the worst of the heat passes. But my kind sweats from the top of the head to the soles of the feet, a thin film of water that the moving air lifts away and carries off, and it takes the heat with it as it goes. It is not the stuff of stories. No one builds a legend around the ability to sweat. But standing in that bowl under those 3 terrible suns, I understood, all at once and in my bones, that while the heat would slowly cook every other living thing in that arena, it would let me keep working long after they had to stop. I did not yet know how much that plain gift would come to mean. But I felt the first edge of it, and the fear in my stomach loosened its grip by a finger's width, and that was enough to start. A horn sounded, long and low, and rolled around the great bowl, and the crowd fell silent all at once. Across the sand a gate opened in the far wall, and he came out, the giant with the red fins, their leader. He strode toward me across that vast distance, and the crowd came apart at the sight of him, screaming his name in their wet rolling tongue, a sound like a sea hurling itself at a cliff. He lifted both arms to them as he walked, and his neck fins spread to their full width, blazing red along every edge, and I understood that I was not facing some ordinary fighter pulled from the ranks. This was their champion, the best they had, the one they sent out when they wanted to be certain of how the story ended. He carried no blade. He did not even glance at the worn old weapon dragging from my hands. The insult of that was plain enough to cross any language. He did not think he would need a blade. His hands, huge and thick and corded, opened and closed at his sides, and they were the only weapons he intended to bring. He stopped a dozen paces from me, and he looked down the short distance between us at the small thing he had been handed to break, and he spoke. I did not know the words. I knew the meaning. He was promising the crowd it would be quick. He was promising them they would barely have time to settle before it was over. I set my feet in the sand. I lifted the blade in both hands, though my arms shook and the point would not stay up, and I let it sink toward the ground because I did not have the strength to hold it high, and I was done pretending otherwise. I let my breath fall into the slow, even rhythm I had carried my whole life. I felt the sweat run down my spine and the three suns lean on my shoulders, and I waited for him to come. He came, and the world turned into noise and motion. I had been in fights before, ugly, clumsy things on cargo docks that lasted only seconds. I thought I understood what fast was. I did not. He crossed the space between us before I had finished drawing a single breath. A blur of dark muscle and reaching hands, and only some old animal part of me, older than thought, threw my body sideways in time. The air where I had been standing cracked with the force of his swing. I felt the wind of it tug at my soaked shirt as I fell past him into a roll. I came up onto my feet and I ran. The crowd jeered, a great rolling boom of disappointment, and I let them. They wanted me to plant my feet and trade blows with a creature twice my height and many times my strength, because that was the only kind of fight they understood. And it would have ended in 3 heartbeats with me on the sand. I had no intention of giving them that. I opened up a long, loose circle around the inner edge of the bowl, my boots throwing up little fans of sand, my eyes always turning back over my shoulder to find him. He chased. Of course he chased. To him I was prey, and prey runs, and the hunter runs it down, and that is the end of it. He came after me in a burst of that terrible speed, and the gap between us closed so fast that my stomach dropped, and at the last possible instant I cut hard across his line. He thundered past the place I had been, unable to turn as sharply as his own speed had thrown him, and he skidded and dug at the sand to stop himself, and I was already gone, moving the other way before he had finished turning around. That was the whole of my plan, and I knew it was a thin one. I could not beat him. I could not even mark him, not truly, not with a blade I could barely lift against a body built like a stone wall. But in those first wild seconds I had learned one thing that lit a small stubborn hope in me. He was faster than me. He was stronger than me past any comparing. But everything he did in a burst, a short shattering rush of speed and power, and then a pause, a gather, a heartbeat where he had to wind himself up again before the next one. He was made like a creature that takes its prey in the first 3 seconds of the chase, or does not take it at all. And I, for all my softness and my smallness and my joke of a weapon, was made like a creature that can keep moving for half a day. So I ran, but I ran cleverly. I did not run flat out because flat out would have burned me to ash as surely as it would burn him. I ran at the easy, steady, ground-eating pace that my body knew better than any other. The pace of a thing that has to cross a wide hot plain with somewhere to be and the whole long day to get there. I circled, and I let him chase, and every time he gathered himself and spent one of those beautiful, costly bursts of speed, I read it in the bunching of his shoulders a breath before it came, and I stepped aside, and I let all that lovely power crash into empty air. The crowd hated it. They had come to see a hard, fast ending, and instead they got a small creature jogging in circles while their champion charged and charged and missed. They booed a deep, ugly tide of it. They threw things, scraps of food and small stones that fell short and pattered onto the sand around me. And the champion grew angry. I saw it gather in him. His blazing fins, which had stood so tall and proud, began to flatten back against his neck, and his rushes came harder and wilder, and he shouted words at me that I did not need to understand. He was telling me to stop running, to stand. to face him and be broken properly, the way the story was supposed to go. I did not stand. I ran and I dodged and I breathed and I sweated, and I let the minutes begin to stack themselves up one upon another. 10 of them passed, I knew, because I counted my own slow breaths and did the quiet arithmetic in the back of my mind, the way you do when you are trying to keep fear from filling all the room inside your head. 10 whole minutes, and I was still on my feet, and the champion of all these thousands had not laid a single finger on me, and the crowd had gone quiet. Not the bored quiet of disappointment, a different quiet, an uncertain one. A quiet that did not know what it was looking at. This was not how it went. Their champion ended fights before the crowd had finished settling, and here was the small dead-looking thing, still circling, still breathing, after 10 whole minutes under 3 suns. And then I saw the first sign, and the small hope in my chest grew teeth. It was in his fins. They had stood up tall and red at the start, proud as flags. Now as the minutes wore on and the heat climbed and his great body labored, the fins began to do something new. They spread wide and held themselves open, flaring out from his neck like sails, trembling faintly in the hot air. At first I did not understand it. Then I did, and I almost stumbled with the force of the understanding. He had no sweat. Of course he did not. His kind cooled their bodies through those broad fins, holding them open to let the heat bleed away into the air around them. And under 3 suns, after 10 long minutes of charging and missing and charging again, his fins could not bleed the heat away fast enough. He was beginning to cook inside his own great strength, and he could not stop it, and there was nothing in all his power that could make those fins work any faster. I had not touched him. I had not marked him. I could not have hurt him if I had spent the whole day trying. But the suns above and the sand below and his own wasted bursts of speed were doing the slow, patient work that I never could. And the only thing I had to do, the only thing in the whole wide world, was keep moving and stay just beyond his reach and let the long minutes go on stacking up. He charged once more, and this time the rush was a half step slower than the one before, and I stepped clear of it more easily than I had stepped clear of any yet. He pulled up hard, his great chest heaving, his fins spread wide and shaking, and he glared at me down the length of the sand with the suns burning white above us both. And there, behind the anger in those dark round eyes, I saw it for the first time, small, new, a thing I do not think he had ever felt in the whole of his proud and certain life, the beginning of doubt. I planted my feet, I drew my breath in slow even sips, and I let him see how easily it came to me, how much I had left. I let the silence of the crowd hang in the hot air between us, and I waited, calm and patient and dripping, for the champion of all those thousands to gather what was left of himself and come at me again. The second time the champion charged me, I did something I had not done before. I let him get close. Closer than was safe, closer than was wise, close enough that I could see the labor in his breathing and the dull gray creeping into his dark skin. And then, instead of cutting away across his line as I had every time before, I held my ground until the very last instant and dropped low beneath his reaching arms, and as he passed over me I came up on the far side and put myself between him and the patch of shade thrown by the bull's high western wall. It was a small thing. He probably did not notice it. But it was the moment the fight quietly turned, though neither of us knew it yet, and I am not sure I understood it fully myself until much later. He had been trying to catch me. From that moment on, I began trying to keep him from resting, because I had seen where his eyes kept going, between his charges, in the gathering pauses where he wound himself up for the next rush. His gaze kept drifting to that strip of shadow under the western wall, the one cool place on all that burning sand. He wanted it the way a thirsty man wants water. He wanted to stand in it for just a moment, to spread his overheating fins in the shade and let them do their work, to gather himself properly before he came at me again. And I understood, with a cold and certain clarity, that the shade was the only thing in that whole arena that could save him. If he reached it and stood in it long enough, his fins would cool, his strength would come trickling back, and the slow work the suns were doing would be undone. So I took the shade away from him, not by fighting for it. I could not have fought him for a square hand's breadth of ground. I took it by simply being there, by drifting into the cool strip every time he turned toward it, by making him choose between resting in the shade with me standing in his path and chasing me back out into the open burning sand. And his pride chose the same thing every time. He could not bear to share the shade with the small creature he had been sent to break. He came after me, out into the suns, again and again, spending strength he could not spare to drive me off a patch of ground I did not even want. I had become, without quite deciding to, the thing that herds, the patient thing on the open plain that cannot run faster than what it hunts, and does not need to. It only needs to be there. To stand between the prey and the water, the prey and the shade, the prey and rest, until the prey understands in its failing body that there will be no rest, not ever, not until it lies down for the last time. The hours wore on. The first of the three suns slid down toward the western rim, and the light turned from white to a deep heavy gold. And still we moved across the sand, the great laboring giant and the small dripping creature who would not be caught. I had stopped counting minutes somewhere in the second hour. I counted my breaths now, and my breaths told me I had been working a long, long time, and that I could keep working a good deal longer. It was somewhere in that long golden stretch that I first noticed her. High up on the stone rim of the bowl, among all the thousands of agitated, restless bodies, there was one who was perfectly still. She sat apart from the others, near the top, and where the crowd around her leaned and shouted, and covered their faces and grabbed at one another, she simply watched. She did not move. Her neck fins, I saw even from that distance, had faded to a soft pale gray, the gray of great age, with none of the proud color left in them. And in her hands she held a small device that she had pointed down at the sand, at me. And she kept it pointed there, steady, hour after hour, while everyone around her came undone. I did not know who she was. I could not have guessed then how much I would come to owe her. But something about that one still figure among all the frantic thousands caught at me, and I found my eyes returning to her again and again across the long afternoon. While the rest of the crowd saw their champion failing and did not know what to feel, she seemed to be watching something else entirely. Something that, far from frightening her, lifted her old faded fins just slightly at the edges, the way a person leans toward an answer they have been waiting their whole life to hear. The crowd itself was changing, and that was a wonder all its own to feel happening around me. In the first hour they had jeered me, a great hungry tide of contempt. In the second they had fallen into that uncertain silence, not knowing what they were looking at. Now, as the golden light deepened and the second hour bled into the third, a new sound began to move through them, low and uneasy, rippling along the packed stone rows like wind moving across deep water. They were not cheering their champion anymore. They had stopped, somewhere, without any single moment you could point to. They were watching their strongest fighter, their certain thing, the one they sent out when they wanted to be sure of the ending, slowly fold in on himself under the suns, worn down by a small soft creature who simply would not stop walking. And they did not know what to feel. I saw fins flatten in rows, in waves, in something that looked very much like fear. I saw heads turn, neighbor to neighbor, as though to ask each other whether what they were seeing could truly be happening, whether the thing their whole world rested upon was really coming apart on the sand below them. And the champion came apart, slowly, in front of them all. When he had walked out at the start, he had been a thing of terrible beauty, all proud muscle and blazing fins and the easy certainty of 100 quick victories in every stride. Now, in the deep gold of the falling first sun, he was someone else. His shoulders had rounded. His head hung low between them. His great chest worked like a bellows, fighting for every breath it pulled in. His fins, which had stood so tall and so red, drooped and spread and flared desperately wide, trembling, dumping a heat they could no longer keep ahead of. His dark skin had gone dull and ashy. His huge hands, which had opened and closed so eagerly at the start, now hung slack and open at his sides, too tired to make the fists he had been so proud of. He had not been harmed. I need that to be understood, because it is the strangest and the truest part of the whole long day. I had never touched him. Not once in all those hours had I struck him or marked him, or done him the smallest injury, because I could not have. He was too strong and I was too small, and the blade I dragged through the sand was a joke between us. Everything that was happening to him, he had done to himself, with every charge and every burst and every wasted rush of his great strength, under 3 suns that asked his body for more than anybody could give. I had only refused to fall on his schedule, and it was turning out that refusing to fall, simply that and nothing more, was the only weapon I had ever needed against him. I remembered then the small flask of water at my belt. They had let me keep it, that one strange kindness when they pushed me out onto the sand. I had not dared to use it, half afraid that to stop even for a swallow would be to give him the moment he needed to catch me. But I understood now that I was the one setting the pace, that he was in no condition to close on me if I gave myself a heartbeat to drink. So I did. As I jogged my wide patient circle, I unhooked the flask, uncapped it, and took a long swallow of warm water without ever breaking stride. The effect of that small act on the crowd was extraordinary. A sound went through them, a sharp collective hiss of astonishment, and I realized with a jolt what it must mean to them. Their kind did not drink during a fight. They could not, perhaps, Or it had simply never once occurred to any fighter in the history of that bowl that a contest might last long enough that drinking would matter. To them, the small creature on the sand had just done something impossible. It had stopped in the middle of the fight to refresh itself, as casually as a traveler pausing at a well, and then it had carried calmly on. And down on the sand their champion, who had no water and no way to take any, watched me drink, and I saw something break a little further behind his eyes. And then he tried to be clever, and he very nearly ended me with it. He stopped charging. He let his shoulders sag and his head drop, and he sank down toward the sand as if his legs had finally given out for good. And he stayed there, swaying, his fins barely flickering. To anyone watching, he looked finished. He looked like a creature with nothing left, a heartbeat from falling on his face. And the part of me that was tired, the part that had been moving for hours, and wanted nothing in the world so much as for this to be over, looked at him crumpled there on the sand and thought, he is done, I can stop now, I can walk in and end it. I took 2 steps toward him before the cold older part of my mind grabbed me by the collar and hauled me back. Because I had been watching him breathe all day, and the breathing was wrong. A creature truly spent does not draw the long, deep, gathering breaths I could see swelling his great chest. Those were not the breaths of a thing dying. Those were the breaths of a thing winding itself up, hoarding air, coiling like a spring under the cover of looking broken. He was not collapsing. He was inviting me in. He had spent the whole day failing to catch a thing that would not come close, and so he had decided to make me come to him, to lure the patient little creature within reach of one last terrible burst. The kind that had opened the fight, the kind that would finish me in a single grasp if it landed. I stopped my forward step so sharply that I nearly fell, and in the very instant I stopped, he sprang. He came up off the sand with a speed I would not have believed was still in him, all that hoarded strength uncoiling at once, his huge hands flung wide to wrap around me and crush the fight out of me for good. If I had taken one more step, if I had believed my own tired eyes for one more breath, he would have had me. I felt the wind of his reaching arms brush my chest as I threw myself backward and down, landing hard on the sand and scrambling away on my hands and heels like a crab while he crashed down into the space where I had stood. For a moment we were both on the ground, an arm's length apart, staring at each other across the hot sand, and I saw in his eyes that he knew his last good trick had failed. He had spent the very last of his hoarded strength on that one spring, and it had closed on nothing, and now there was truly nothing left in the well to draw from. I rolled to my feet. He could not. He pushed himself up onto his hands, and his arms shook, and that was as far as he got. The crowd had come to its feet at the spring, a great gasping roar, and now it sank back into its uneasy silence, because every one of those thousands had seen it too. They had seen their champion gather himself for one final effort, the kind of effort that had ended 100 fights, and they had seen it land on empty air, and they had seen the small creature roll up onto its feet while the giant could not rise past his own trembling hands. Whatever doubt had been spreading through the bowl, that one failed spring turned it into something close to certainty. I caught my own breath, and I made myself remember it, that brush of his hands against my chest. I had let myself believe he was finished, just for 2 steps, just for a moment, and it had nearly cost me everything. I promised myself I would not make that mistake again. The patient thing on the plane does not relax because the prey has stopped moving. It waits, it is sure. It does not close in until there is nothing left to fear, and even then it closes in carefully. He gathered himself one more time. It took him longer than it ever had. I could see the effort it cost him just to bunch his shoulders, to push off from the sand, and when the charge came it was a poor stumbling ghost of the lightning rushes from the first hour. I did not even need to run from it. I simply took one easy step to the side and let him lurch past, and he could not pull himself up cleanly, and his legs had nothing left in them to catch his weight, and he went down onto one knee in the sand, with a low groan that I felt in my own chest. More than heard. I stopped. I stood perhaps 10 paces from him, and I did not run, because for the first time in all those hours he was not coming after me. I set my feet in the hot sand and I looked at him, kneeling there with his head hanging and his breath tearing in and out of him, the mightiest creature in all that enormous crowd, brought to the ground by the plain stubbornness of a thing his people had carried toward the fire as a corpse. And I felt no triumph. That surprised me more than anything else that day. I had imagined in the cell that if I ever somehow reached this moment I would feel a hot, bright rush of victory. Instead, what rose in me was something quieter and far stranger. Something that sat heavy and serious in my chest. It was a kind of respect, and underneath the respect a kind of sorrow, for this proud creature who had never in his long life met an opponent he could not simply overpower, and who was learning now, in front of his whole people, in the most public way there is, what it feels like to be the one who runs out first. I had hoarded their words like coins, all through the long day and the longer night before it. I picked the one that fit, slowly, clearly, so that he and every silent soul in that vast bowl could hear it and understand. I spoke their hard barking word for rise. The word the guard had used when he wanted another to get up off his bench. Stand up, I was telling him. Get up, I am not finished. And neither are you. He lifted his head. Across the short stretch of sand, his dark round eyes found mine and held them. And in that look I saw the thing I had glimpsed an hour before, grown now into something vast and undeniable, filling him from the inside. It was not anger anymore. It was something his kind had never needed a word for, because in all their history they had never once been here. It was the bottomless confusion of a hunter who has finally, somehow, become the hunted. The slow drowning understanding of a creature who has just realized, in his failing body, that he is going to be the one to fall. The crowd held its breath. The old pale-finned watcher on the rim leaned forward over her steady device, and the giant, with a groan that seemed to come up from the floor of the world, planted one trembling foot in the sand, and pushed and slowly, shaking in every part of himself, rose back onto his feet to face me. The second sun touched the western rim, one light left in the whitening sky, and I understood, watching him sway there with the last of his strength, that whatever happened next was going to mean something far larger than the two of us standing in the cooling sand. The last sun sank lower, and the great bowl filled with shadow. The fierce white glare that had hammered us all day softened into a long amber light that stretched our shadows out thin and strange across the sand. The killing heat eased, just a little, just enough that I felt the change in my own body before I understood what it meant. My sweat, which had run so freely all afternoon, came slower now. The air had begun to cool, and a cooling world does not lift the heat from a working back the way a burning one does. The very thing that had been my quiet advantage all day was beginning, by tiny degrees, to fade with the falling sun. I will be honest about where I was, because the truth of it matters more than any boast. I was not a machine. I have never been a machine. I was a small, soft, tired creature who had been moving for the better part of an afternoon, and the tiredness had stopped being something I noticed in my legs, and become something that lived in the whole of me, deep down in the bone. My feet were raw inside my boots. My hands had blistered and torn and gone numb around the worn grip of a blade I had never once swung. My slow heart, which had carried me so faithfully all day, was working hard now, harder than it liked, and I could feel it asking me quietly how much longer I meant to keep this up. But I looked at him, and I did the only arithmetic that mattered, the cold, simple sum I had been working since the very first charge. Whatever was left in me, there was less left in him. However tired I was, he was more tired. And the cooling of the world that was slowly taking away my advantage would not save him, because he was already so far past the edge of his strength that no easing of the heat could call it back. I was running low. He was running on nothing. And in a contest that had become, in the end, a simple question of who emptied out first, running low beats running on nothing every single time. So I kept doing the only thing I knew how to do. I moved, I circled. I stood between him and the shade and between him and rest. And I let the long minutes go on stacking themselves up, and I waited for the well in him to run completely dry. It was somewhere in that last amber stretch that the full weight of what I was doing settled onto me, and it was heavier than I had expected, because I understood, suddenly and completely, that I did not have to do anything more at all. I could simply stop. I could plant my feet at a safe distance and stand still and do nothing, nothing whatever. And the suns and the long day and his own ruined, overheated body would finish the work without any help from me. He could not reach me. He could barely lift himself off the sand. If I just waited, just stood and watched and let the heat keep its slow grip on him, he would go down, and he would not get up, and it would be over. And I would not have lifted a finger to make it happen. The patient thing on the plane does not always need a final blow. Sometimes it only needs to wait while the prey lies down in the heat for the last time. And I could feel that the crowd expected it. The thousands of silent gray bodies on the stone rim had stopped hoping for their champion and started waiting for his end the way a crowd does with a terrible quiet hunger. To them the story had only one possible last page. The fight ended when one fighter could not rise, and the one still standing finished it, and that was strength, and that was the whole of what they understood. They were waiting for me to give them the ending their world had taught them to expect. I could feel the waiting pressing down on me with the cooling air. I thought about the cold slab. I thought about the row of my lost crew, and the machine that had searched my chest, and found nothing it knew how to recognize. And the bored, tired creatures who had decided I was a corpse and begun to carry me toward the fire with the dead. They had looked at me and seen a body. They had looked at me and seen nothing worth saving. A thing already finished. A thing whose only remaining use was to be cleared away. That was the picture of me they had built, and every part of it had been wrong. And I understood, standing there in the long amber light with the whole bowl waiting for me to be cruel, that if I stood and watched the giant die when I did not have to, if I let the heat finish him while I looked on, I would be agreeing with that machine. I would be becoming the thing they had mistaken me for on the slab. A finisher. A clearer away of the spent and the fallen. I had spent the whole long day proving that they had been wrong about what I was. I was not about to prove them right in the last hour of it. So I made a decision, somewhere in that cooling light, and once I had made it the heaviness lifted off me and something steadier took its place. I would not let him die for the crowd. Whatever happened at the end of this, it was not going to be that, but I also would not let him win. So I kept him moving, and I kept him from rest, and I waited for him to empty out completely, so that when the end came it would come on my terms and not the crowd's. High on the rim, the old pale-finned watcher rose to her feet. I noticed it because she was the only one who moved. All the rest sat frozen in their hungry silence. But she stood slowly, near the top of the bowl, and she lowered the small device she had held, pointed at the sand for so many hours. She did not need to record anymore. She had seen what she had come to see, whatever it was, and now she simply stood and watched with her own eyes. Leaning forward, her faded fins lifted at the edges, as though she were waiting not for an ending but for an answer. Below her, the giant tried again. He had nothing left, and he knew it. And still he tried, because pride is the very last thing to leave a creature like that, long after the strength is gone. He pushed himself up off the sand, swaying and lurched toward me in something that was barely a charge at all, more a controlled fall in my direction, his arms reaching weakly for a grip he could no longer close. I did not run. I did not need to run anymore. I simply shifted my weight and stepped clear, one easy pace to the side, and let him stumble past into the empty amber air. And he went down onto his hands and knees again with a sound like something heavy settling for the night. He got up, I let him. He came again, slower, and again I stepped aside, and again he went down, and again he got up because he could not yet make himself stop, and again he came, and each time the charge was a little smaller, and a little slower, and a little more pitiful than the one before, until it was no longer a charge of any kind, but only a creature dragging itself toward another creature out of habit, out of pride, out of the last guttering ember of a thing that had once been the certainty of 100 easy victories. It was during one of those failing charges, when he had gone down onto his knees yet again and knelt there gathering himself, that he spoke to me for the first time. It was not much. His voice came out cracked and ruined, scraped raw by hours of hard breathing, barely more than a rasp. But it was a word, one of the few I had learned, and it landed in me harder than any of his charges ever had. He lifted his head, and he looked at me with those dark, exhausted eyes, and he rasped out their word for why. Why, that was all. Why do you not finish it? Why do you keep me on my feet? Why, when you have clearly won, do you not do the one thing that winning is for? I did not have enough of his language to answer him properly, and even if I had, I am not sure I could have found the words in any tongue. So I gave him the only answer I had, which was no answer at all and the truest one I owned. I shook my head slowly, side to side, the way you tell a child no without anger. And I spoke again the one word I had given him before, the hard word for rise, get up. Not yet. We are not finished, and the finish is not what you think it is. He stared at me as though I had spoken pure madness. In his whole world there was no other reason to keep an enemy standing, except to break him properly. The idea that I might be keeping him on his feet for some purpose other than his ending did not fit anywhere inside the things he knew. I watched him try to make it fit, and fail, and the failing seemed to trouble him more than the exhaustion did. And then a sound came down from the rim, and it nearly undid all my resolve. It started small, in one section of the crowd, a low rhythmic call, and it spread along the stone rows until thousands of voices had taken it up, a deep pulsing chant rolling around the great bowl. I did not know the words, but I did not need to. A crowd that has watched its champion fall and wants the ending does not need translating in any corner of the galaxy. They were calling for the finish. They were telling me, in their thousands, what their world expected of the one left standing, and the sound of it pressed down on me with a weight that was hard to bear. Harder than the heat had been, harder than the tiredness in my bones. It would have been so easy, so simple, to give them what they were demanding, and let the terrible chant turn into a cheer. I looked down at the giant, kneeling in front of me, ruined and confused and waiting, and I looked up at the thousands chanting for his end, and I made myself stand very still inside the noise. I had decided already. I had decided in the cooling light that I would not become the thing the slab had mistaken me for. A crowd's wanting was not going to unmake a decision I had made in my own quiet heart. I let the chant break against me like surf against a stone, and I did not move, and slowly when the finish did not come, the chant faltered and stuttered, and died away into a confusion deeper than any silence. And then he came one last time, and went down onto his hands and knees one last time, and this time he did not get up. I want to be precise about this, because it is the heart of the whole thing. He did not fall because I struck him down. I never struck him at all. He fell because there was nothing left in him to keep him standing, because the long day and the 3 suns and his own great wasted strength had emptied him out completely, and a body with nothing left in it lies down whether its owner wishes it to or not. He knelt there on the sand with his head hanging and his arms shaking and his great chest heaving for air, and he tried, I saw him try, to push himself up one final time. His arms would not answer, he stayed down. The whole bowl went utterly, perfectly silent. Tens of thousands of creatures, and not one breath of sound from any of them. The amber light lay long and still across the sand. Even the air seemed to be holding itself, waiting. I walked toward him. I walked slowly because slow was all my own legs had left in them, and because there was no longer any reason to hurry. As I walked, I reached down and I took the heavy blade out of my torn and numb hands, and I let it fall to the sand behind me. It landed with a soft thud and lay there, forgotten, the worn old weapon I had dragged through the whole long day and never once raised against him. I did not want it in my hands for what came next. I had never needed it. It had been a joke from the moment he tossed it into my cell, and I was done carrying the joke. I let it lie in the sand and I walked on toward the fallen giant with my hands open and empty at my sides. I stopped in front of him, close enough now to see everything. Close enough to see the dull ashy gray that had spread all through his skin, the way his fins lay limp and spent against his neck with not a trace of red left in them, the great ragged labor of each breath he hauled in and pushed out. The mightiest creature these people had ever made, undefeated through a long proud life, sent out to break a thing they had carried toward the fire as a corpse, was kneeling in the sand at the feet of that very corpse, with nothing left to lift him. He raised his head. It cost him something to do even that. I could see it cost him, but he raised it, and his dark round eyes came up and found mine and held them. He was not asking for anything. His kind did not ask. But there was a question in that look all the same, an enormous one. The question the whole silent bowl was asking with him. The question his entire world had been built to answer one way and one way only. What does the one still standing do now? I thought, in that long suspended moment, of all the things that look could have meant on my own world, where I had grown up and learned what kind of creature I am. I thought of the runners back home who finish a long race and then turn around and walk back along the road to keep company with the ones still struggling toward the line. I thought of the strange, stubborn gentleness that seems to live in creatures of old built for endurance, the ones who win not by being the strongest in the room, but by being the very last to give up, and who therefore understand, better than the strong ever could, exactly how it feels to reach the place where there is nothing left. We are not, as a people, the hardest hitters in any room we walk into. We have spent the long ages of our history learning a different lesson, that the race goes not to the swiftest but to the one who keeps moving when moving has stopped being possible. And somewhere in all that keeping on, weeps something else as well, something the giant's proud people had never once had cause to learn. We learned what to do with a fallen runner. You do not stand over them and name yourself great. You reach down. I stood over the fallen giant in the long amber light, with the eyes of a whole people pressing down on me and not a single sound in all that vast bowl, and I felt the moment open up beneath me like a held breath, and I knew that whatever I did in the next few seconds would mean something far larger than the two of us, larger than the fight, larger than this one cooling evening on a planet beneath 3 setting suns. The crowd waited. The old watcher on the rim leaned out over the silence. The giant knelt at my feet and looked up at me and waited. And the last sun touched the rim of the world, and slid down behind it, and was gone. In the dark that followed the last sun, with the bowl lit now only by the cold blue glow of lamps set high along the rim, I made my choice. I reached down to my belt and unhooked the small flask of water. There was a little left in it, warm and flat, the last of the one kindness they had shown me. I uncapped it, and I crouched down on aching legs in front of the fallen giant, close enough to feel the heat still pouring off his ruined body, and I held the flask out to him, the way you would offer water to anyone who had run a long, hard road and had nothing left to run on. A sound went through the crowd, a single sharp intake of breath from thousands of throats at once, and then silence again, deeper than before. He stared at the flask. His dark eyes moved from the small vessel in my hand up to my face and back down again, and I watched the confusion in him swell into something close to fear, a fear far larger than any he could have felt of being struck down. To be defeated was one thing. His world had a place for that, even if he had never been there. But to be offered water by the creature that had brought him down, to be tended like a fallen friend by the thing he had been sent to break, fit nowhere in anything he understood. For a long moment he did not move, and I did not know whether he would knock the flask from my hand, or strike at me with whatever was left in him, or simply refuse it and let his pride finish what the suns had started. And then a voice rang out across the dark bowl, clear and strong and entirely unafraid. It came from high on the rim, from the place where the old pale-finned watcher had stood, and I knew without looking whose it was. She called down into the silence in their wet rolling tongue, and her voice carried to every corner of that enormous space, and the whole crowd turned toward her as one, a great rustling of bodies and fins, and the strange charged tension that had filled the bowl stilled into listening. She spoke for a long time. I could not follow the words then, though she taught them to me later, slowly, so that I would carry them right. She pointed down at me, crouched in the sand with the flask in my hand. She pointed at the giant kneeling before me. She swept her arm across the dark bowl, at the empty sky where the three suns had been, at the long shadows, at the place on the sand where the whole impossible day had played out. And as she spoke, I watched something move through the thousands like a slow wind bending a field of grain, heads lifting, fins rising, a low murmur that was no longer hungry, no longer afraid, but thoughtful and shaken and new. What she told them, I learned afterward, was this. She told them they had been watching the wrong thing for the whole length of their history. She told them that for as long as their people had kept any memory at all, they had believed they knew what strength was, and that what they believed was that strength is the blow, the strike, the hard, fast, shattering rush of power that ends a contest in seconds and leaves the strong one standing and the weak one fallen. On that single idea, she said, they had built everything, their fighters, their warships, their conquests across the dark, their whole proud sense of who they were among the stars. And then she pointed at me, the small soft creature crouched in the sand holding out water to their fallen champion, and she told them they had just spent an entire day watching that idea come apart. Because the small creature had never once struck their champion. Not one blow had landed, in all those hours, because the small creature had never thrown one. And yet their champion knelt defeated on the sand, emptied out, unable to rise, beaten as thoroughly as any fighter had ever been beaten in that bowl. He had been brought down, she told them, not by a harder blow but by a thing they had never thought to put any value on at all, by endurance, by patience, by a creature that simply, calmly, refused to stop, under suns that asked too much, until the mightiest of them had spent everything he had, and the small, stubborn thing was still, standing, still breathing, with water to spare. And then, she said, having won, the small creature had done the strangest thing of all. It had not finished him. It had reached down instead and offered him water, and that, she told her people, that gesture, was a second kind of strength they had been too proud ever to see. A strength that had nothing to do with the blow, and everything to do with what a creature chooses to do once the blow is no longer needed. When she finished, the silence in the bowl was complete. And in that silence, the giant in front of me reached out one huge trembling hand and took the flask and drank. It was a small motion. He simply raised the little vessel to his mouth and let the last of the warm water pass his lips. But by the deepest and oldest customs of his people, customs I did not yet understand and that he understood all too well, that small motion was the largest thing he had ever done. To accept water from the one who has bested you, I learned later, is among his kind the most complete surrender there is. An admission made before all witnesses that you have met something stronger than yourself and live to drink to it. No champion of their people had ever made that admission. None had ever had cause to. He was the first, and he made it in front of his entire world, kneeling in the dark with the lamps cold and blue along the rim. The bowl came apart, not in anger, in a sound I had not heard from them before and have never forgotten, a high rolling cry that rose from every row at once and shook the old stone walls, a sound that held grief and wonder and something like joy all tangled together past any separating. It was not the ugly, hungry roar from the beginning of the day. It was the sound of a whole people feeling the ground move under an idea they had stood upon for longer than any of them could remember. The giant lowered the empty flask. He looked at me, really looked, and the confusion that had filled his eyes had given way at last to something simpler and far clearer: understanding. He had spent his entire long life certain that he knew what strength was, and in the space of a single day, a small creature from a world he had never heard of had shown him he had only ever known the half of it. He pressed one huge hand flat against the sand. Then he pressed it against his own laboring chest, and then he held it out toward me, palm open, trembling with exhaustion but steady in its purpose. I did not know the gesture, but I understood it the way you understand any honest thing that is offered plainly. I reached out and laid my own small, torn, blistered hand against his enormous one, and the crowd cried out again, louder, and the great rolling sound went up into the dark sky where the three suns had been. That was the end of the fight. It was the beginning of everything that came after. In the days that followed, I learned their language, slowly, with the patient help of the old watcher from the rim. Her name, as near as my mouth could shape the sounds of it, was Vesa. She had once been a great thinker among her people, a planner of their wars and a student of their conquests, before she had fallen out of favor for the unforgivable crime of asking too many awkward questions about the way things had always been done. She told me she had spent her whole long life with a splinter in her mind, a feeling she could never quite name, that her people's worship of the hard, fast blow was missing something enormous, and that she had never once been able to point to what, until she sat on the rim of that bowl and watched a small soft creature circle the sand for the better part of a day and bring down a champion she could not have imagined falling. I had given her, without meaning to, the proof she had been hunting her whole life. In return, she gave me the words I needed to live, and then word by word the understanding of where I truly was. The giant's name was Koresh. He had been the champion of his people for longer than any before him, undefeated, certain, the living proof of everything they believed. And he was, by the deep binding customs of his kind, now tied to me. The one who is bested in the great bowl in lives, Vesa explained, becomes bound to the one who bested him, in a bond their people took more seriously than nearly anything else in their world. It was not a chain. It was not slavery. It was something closer to the deepest kind of partnership there is, a debt of honor that ran in both directions and could not be broken by either of us. Koresh, the mightiest of all his people, was now sworn to stand at my side, and stranger still, he seemed glad of it, the way a person is glad to finally set down a weight they have carried alone for far too long. The three of us became an unlikely thing, the old thinker who had questioned everything and been cast out for it, the fallen champion who had learned that there was more to strength than he had ever been taught, and me, the small soft creature from a world none of them had ever heard of, who had survived being carried toward the fire by being too stubborn to lie down. We made a strange company, and a strong one, and in the long quiet evenings, Vesa would ask me question after question about my people, about how we lived and where we had come from, scribbling everything down, as though she were filling in the empty places on a map she had been staring at all her life. And the story of the bowl spread. It did not stay among the creatures of that one warship or that one world. It traveled the way the most important stories always travel, faster than any ship could have carried it, passed from mouth to mouth and rim to rim across their wide and warlike civilization. The story of the creature they had carried toward the fire as a body, who had woken, and stood, and worn down their greatest champion, not with a single blow, but with a patience that would not break. The story of the small soft thing that simply did not stop. And here is the part of it that matters most. The part I did not understand until Vesa sat me down one quiet evening and made me understand it. Her people had been planning for some time to move against the worlds where my own kind lived. They had looked at us from a distance and seen exactly what Koresh had seen across the sand at the start of the day. Small, soft, slow, a people without the proud fins and the crushing hands and the hard fast blow they worshipped above all else. Easy prey, they had thought, the kind of thing that falls in the first 3 seconds of any contest. They had been wrong about a great many things, I came to learn, but they had never been more wrong than they had been about that. After the bowl, the planning stopped, because every creature in that whole civilization had now heard the story, and folded somewhere inside the story was a warning that even the proudest of them could not pretend away. You might win the first hour against one of these creatures, the story said. You might win the first minute, the first 3 seconds, the opening rush, the hard fast blow you have built your whole world around. But the creature does not stop. It keeps coming after you have spent everything you have. It is still standing when your suns go down, still breathing, still walking toward you, patient and certain and impossible to finish, and in the long run, in the only run that has ever truly mattered, It is the creature who is left on its feet, and you who is kneeling in the sand. They had built their entire idea of war upon the opening blow. And they had watched, in front of a whole bowl of witnesses, exactly what becomes of the opening blow when it lands on a thing that was built for the long road and does not know how to quit. They decided very quietly and very wisely to leave us alone. I made it home in the end. Vesa arranged the passage, calling in favors from the old days when her word had carried weight, and Koresh himself saw me to the edge of their territory, the fallen champion and the small, stubborn creature standing together one last time at the border of the great dark between our two peoples. He did not have many words for the parting. His kind never did, and even now, even bound to me, even changed. He was still a creature more comfortable with deeds than with speech. But he pressed one huge hand flat against his chest, and held it out to me, the same gesture he had offered in the sand of the bowl, and I laid my own hand against it. And that was enough. That was everything that needed saying. I think about that cold slab sometimes, even now. The one where they laid me down in a neat row with the crew I had lost, where their machine searched my chest for a racing, frightened heartbeat and found instead only my slow and quiet one, and decided, in its certainty, that I was gone. I think about how close I came to the fire, and about the strange turning of it, that the very thing which nearly finished me, that slow, patient pulse too soft for their instruments to hear, was the same thing that carried me through everything that followed, and brought me out the other side alive. They thought the human was dead. That was the first mistake, the one they built all their other mistakes on top of. They could not find my heart, because they did not understand the kind of alive that I am. And here is the thing I would tell them, and the thing I would tell anyone, anywhere, who looks at my kind and sees something small and soft and easy to finish. We do not have the fastest hearts in the galaxy. We do not have the strongest hands, or the proudest fins, or the hard and shattering blow. What we have is older and quieter and far more dangerous than any of those, and it is this. We have the heart that keeps beating, slow and steady and stubborn, long after everything around it has stopped. We are the ones who do not give up. We are the ones who are still walking forward when the suns have set and the strong have knelt down in the sand. We are the ones who, having outlasted everything you can throw at us, will reach down at the end and offer you water. Every creature in that wide and warlike civilization knows it now. They learned it in a bowl of hot sand under 3 setting suns, watching a thing they had carried toward the fire stand up and walk and quietly outlast the very best they had, and then refuse to be cruel about the winning. They will not forget it, and neither will I.